many times when we sprint to the finish, we look back, who are the people that we want to have an impact on? Where does our legacy do? And many times it's around our family. And then it goes back to our top priority, which is our faith. So we end where we began, which is saying, okay, our legacy won't be in our recreation. Right? Our legacy won't be valued at work, right? It'll be forgotten, or our production. Our legacy may be valued in our family, but our legacy ultimately will be a result of our faith.
Welcome back to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I am Art Calderon, here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a CEO, a father, a husband, a local community leader, and is here with us today to talk a lot about life and some of the ideas and things that you've been through, Reed. Hard to believe we're at the end of season 1. Thought it would never end, thought it would never get going. Here we are. We are finishing up this last segment of season 1, a legacy of purpose, and we're going to finish it with episode 28, Sprint Through the Finish. Before we jump into that, I'm going to kick it over to you this time, Reed, so you can do a little recap of where we've been these whole past 28 episodes.
Yeah, and so we started at the very beginning, if you remember, on our priorities, right? I mean, if we're going to sprint through the finish, we have to know where we start. And that's with our priorities, right? And that finish line has to be defined through our priorities. And then ultimately, we recognize that throughout life, whether by default or otherwise, we're going to have habits. Those habits are going to basically define our life, right? So whatever we habitually do will become what we're known for, and we want to make sure that we understand those. And then when we have those habits defined, we want to make sure we know our purpose. That purpose should be clear, should be something we have always top of mind, because ultimately then we can start that journey and we can operationalize that in our lives, looking at it at whether it's 5 years, 1 year, quarterly, monthly, daily, weekly, all the way down to the moments, right? And the minutes and the meetings and the moments. And we've talked through all of that. And then now how do we carry that forward in our legacy? Who is that ultimately going to be passed along to, and how do we create that legacy on purpose? And that's where we're at now. And, there may be listeners, and this may not be our listeners. They may not have the podcast, but we can send them a telegram. We can send them a telegram as they're finished strong, right? I mean, we'll make sure we either by Morse code or send a telegram that they're finishing strong. But ultimately, regardless of where our listeners are at, they will eventually be at the end. And the objective there is to finish strong, run through the finish so that we can ultimately live that life truly on purpose and fulfill that legacy.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about legacy here in the recent podcast. So why then should we always keep the end in mind as we live our life on purpose? Why is that so important to remember? It's not just about right now and today.
If we look at all the things we've accomplished in life, right? And maybe it's graduating college. Maybe it's buying our first house. Maybe it's doing something. There was a destination we ultimately had in mind that we were working towards. And it was fulfilling to get that college degree or to get that first house and get the keys and move in. And we achieved that destination. Now, if we don't have a destination, what are we doing? We're wandering, right? We're just wandering around life saying, I don't know where I want to end up. I don't know what I want to do. And so if we have that destination in mind, now we're working towards something. And that's where fulfillment comes in, achieving that goal and estimate. And so then it's very theoretical as to what a good life is, right? If I go ask on the street, living a life on purpose, and I was walking around with a microphone, they would say, just do what you feel, right? Or it's not really definitive.
Follow your heart.
Follow your heart, right? And yet, even as I unfortunately have to go to funerals from time to time, what was a successful life? But everybody says this was a successful life. And that's so theoretical. That's not tangible for us. And then ultimately, success is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And so if it's our life, we should define what we want to be defined as for the sake of success, and or that is living out our purpose. We were all created on purpose for a purpose. And so this exercise, these episodes should have helped us understand why we were created, what was our unique purpose, and then do it and stay in that purpose through the entirety of our lives, even through the finish. And therein will lie our legacy, that we adhere to our purpose.
So life is short, as we know, and we love a good ending, right? Everybody loves a good ending. But why don't you believe we should just be okay, I'm retired now, or I'm going to retire in 5 or 10 years or 20 years. And when that happens, I'm just going to rest and relax and enjoy the sun and not really plan anything, do anything, and just enjoy life. And why is that? What do you find wrong with that statement?
Yeah, I think the first question you ask is this: one, who am I living for? And the second one is, who am I dying for?
Mhm.
And so if we look at retirement, I think that a question is answered. I've been living for someone else, and now I'm living for myself. But if we answer that question in a different setting, saying, I've always been living for my family and I'm dying for my family. So I think sometimes when we're saying, I've been working for the proverbial man,
Mhm.
and now I'm done, I'm worn out, right? I've given my best for that particular thing. Instead of saying, regardless of what I'm doing, I am living for my purpose and I'm dying for my purpose. And so that then clarifies what you do on a day-to-day basis, right? And so that is where the legacy ultimately comes in. And so ultimately, then that's how you can have huge influence by saying that you leave a legacy on purpose. And so, somebody that I know that's left a great legacy on purpose is actually Billy Graham.
Hmm.
You know, I Billy Graham was a theologian
Mhm.
and he was really an evangelist, and
Mhm.
he would create these huge events that he'd bring all these individuals in, and many people knew that he was there. But what I recognized was that his message never changed. I mean, here was a guy in his 20s and 30s that's going all across the world, quite frankly, and in front of millions and millions and millions of people. And he had a very similar message and even a similar person leading the music. And then he's in his 90s. And here he is, and he goes back to the same exact message at that exact same time that he shared always. And he thought it was even more relevant at that time with minor changes to the story. And ultimately, if we were to say who had a legacy that is enduring, and Billy Graham's one of the top, 10 or 20 that many people of that generation would
Mhm.
agree to. And what was it? Because he knew who he was living for and he knew who he was dying for. It goes back to that same thing. He didn't live for income. He was living for others and dying for others. And that was a legacy that we can look up to. And so I think so many times we think, okay, I'll live for a period of time and accumulate this wealth. And then that wealth will be enough to sustain me going forward.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then is that the legacy we want? That somebody can get all our old stuff when we're going through an estate auction?
Right.
I mean, is that our legacy?
Yeah.
That
Pretty
those
weak.
pretty weak, right? We valued all these things while we're alive. Now we're dead, and no one values them the same way, right? That's what a estate auction is. Or do we say I created value in someone else,
Mhm.
and that value I created will carry forward, right? And so as a result of that, we can see older generations. And those older generations, quite frankly, at least my grandparents, they didn't have a ton, but they did teach me a ton. And so, which legacy are we leaving? The possession legacy or the education legacy? And so, what did they teach me? And I remember, and this was a story about my grandfather, and I remember he was on dialysis, and so he had kidney failure, and he was there as as he's failing. So we knew, kind of around that period of time, how
Mhm.
long that's going to
Mhm.
last when they take him
Mhm.
off dialysis. And he was, just like many people of his generation, he did not want to have someone take care of him. And so he was losing the ability to walk. His circulation was very poor and he couldn't walk.
Mhm.
And so he decided it was the end. And I remember at the end, it was very close. And he was upset because he didn't want people to think that he had, ultimately decided to end his life. It was
Mhm.
a circumstance. And so he's upset about that. And I remember at the time I had just come, early in my faith, and I knew that it was on my heart to go share with him, and it was at his very end. And I went there and I was asking him, I said, Grandpa, what? And it was just me and him there. And we wanted to, he had the sunroom and we're sitting outside, and, he knew the end was coming. Right. And he was still, able to pay attention, but he was, losing his mobility. And I remember sitting there and I talked to him, I said, Grandpa, what can you share with me that would be a life lesson? Because I know this would be our last time. We all had our time. And he said, ultimately make the best of what you have. And I was like, well, that's good information, because so many times we try to make life and have better
Uh-huh.
than what we have. And we try to complain of what we don't have, but make the best of what we have. And, as I'm sitting there and we're talking and we talked about all this stuff, he said, I could have asked for something that everybody else had. I could have wanted things that I would have never had,
Mhm.
but instead I decided to make the best of what I had. And then ultimately through that process, we had an extended conversation. But then afterwards, he passed away, and we came back a couple of weeks later, and we're just going through the things, helping my grandma and everything else. And sure enough, I began to look around, and it wasn't just what he said, it's what he did. Because just like many farmers, he was a long-term farmer. He would take what he had and fashion it into something else. And so, one of the things, they lived on a lake, and that's where they were retired. And they had this boat, a dock, and everything else. And it was all leftover things from the farm that he built. He like took the best of what he had and made the best he could. And it's like, wow, he just innovated in all these things that you can now purchase, a finished product. But that's always what he did. That's how he lived his life. He'd say, hey, we have this, we'll make it work. And then as we continued that story, my dad would talk about how he made a golf cart, or he made a go-kart. And basically, my grandfather was taking a motor from this and wheels from that, and he made the best of what he had. And my dad loved that go-kart. He always talked about it as he's telling the story about that was his favorite toy growing up, is this Frankenstein golf cart my grandpa had built, making the best with what he had. And so what was his legacy? It wasn't just what he said to me on his last words, make the best with what you have. It's how he lived. And that's why it had impact. Because of course we can give this end of life quote that we want to tell the others, but if we didn't live, it didn't resonate. And so if you're sprinting to the finish, even towards the end, then live that life that you would share with others at the end, and make sure that they could see the evidence of that, later.
You mentioned Billy Graham, and I read his autobiography. Big book, and I was like, and he's already very, very old when it came out. And I was excited to read it. And, I found it boring.
Mm.
I was like, boring? Why is this? It was boring because he lived a life about others, and it was always about, now his life affected tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people. And they would all say, wow, he did this great work and it affected me, but it wasn't about him. This book could have been a big tell-all about all the travels he did and all the things he saw and all the crazy stories he must have had. But I found it amazing that I think in finally it showed his humility in life and living so that it'd be a legacy for other people. You mentioned your grandfather. You could still look around and see, this was his life simply by the things he left behind and what he left behind, and wasn't really all about him.
Yeah, and even the sprint to the finish, right? And I can remember specifically that last week, since we were already telling that story, there was one thing he really wanted to do. And, he was married to my grandmother for 50 years. I remember their 50-year anniversary. And at that time, he said, I said, the family all came together. He said, what do you want to do before you die? I said, I want to make sure that she's taken care of in my death. And so he wanted to buy her a car, because the car they had was already 10 years old. And, he knew that was a decision he always made as the family leader. In that case, is what car. And this one wasn't going to be one that she was comfortable driving. He had a pickup too, and she wasn't comfortable driving that. So I'll never forget that it was a Toyota Camry. And you had your LE luxury edition. It was very similar to your long-standing Camry that you put hundreds of thousands of miles on.
386,000 miles before he gave up the ghost.
Yeah, that's another artifact that we don't need.
It was a real artifact.
It was a real artifact, in fact. But ultimately, he wanted to get this car for her because he wanted to know in peace, he could rest in peace when he knew that it was there. And of course, now there can be every reason not to move. And so I remember it took a couple of days. We found a local dealer that found a particular car that he wanted that had good fuel efficiency, and this was that Camry. And the dealer was willing to bring it to the house because my grandfather was not mobile. I mean, he had decided that he was basically in a bed, a hospital bed in the house. And so it was a lot of work for him to go anywhere, right, at this point. And he said, I want to see it. And we're like, it's, days, if not hours away. And he said, I want to see it. And I remember, here's a guy that's putting every last energy into making sure that his wife of 50 years, even though she had some emotional loss and she'd been there, and of course any significant other leaving is traumatic, he wanted to make sure she was cared for. And so we collectively, I remember getting him in this wheelchair. And I mean, you had to move every arm and body. I mean, his body was really shutting down, and we wheeled him out there. And it wasn't just he had to see the car, he had to get around the car, right? And so we're wheeling him around the car. And I mean, it almost makes me emotional telling the story, because here is a guy that with his last energy wanted to make sure that his family was cared for.
He couldn't move, he couldn't walk, but he was sprinting through the finish.
And he's like, let me see the back. That's right. He's like, every last bit of energy, right, was to make sure that the legacy, his family, all of us were there, including his wife, were cared for in his absence. It wasn't about, woe is me, my life is ending early, any of these other things. And I remember as we had wheeled him around and he said, yeah, I think that'll do. Something like that. I mean, just really understated as you'd expect from that. That'll do. And so they're like, sign the paperwork now, and so ultimately we got the car figured out, of course. But ultimately afterwards, I saw him get wheeled back. We worked together to put him into his bed, and you could see that a peace overcame him. And, it is something that I'd never seen before. And we rarely get to see these stages in life, right? We're at a funeral, but we don't see the last moments. And that is when you could see that he recognized that he sprinted through the finish. That at the end, he had done everything in his power and maybe even beyond his power to create a legacy within his family that he knew was part of his purpose, including caring for his wife, even till death do we part. And it was that time where I saw marriage in a different way, even though I was, not even yet married at that time, actually. And I recognized that, okay, here is where even towards the end, death do us part. And he was to the last minute. That's who he cared for. And I think many times when we sprint to the finish, we look back, who are the people that we want to have an impact on? Where does our legacy do? And many times it's around our family. And then it goes back to our top priority, which is our faith. So we end where we began, which is saying, okay, our legacy won't be in our recreation. Right? Our legacy won't be valued at work, right? It'll be forgotten, or our production. Our legacy may be valued in our family, but our legacy ultimately will be a result of our faith. And I think that's true in my life. It's true in many lives, and it's true in Billy Graham's life, that even though his life was boring, as you read the book, the result and impact of his faith is enduring.
Yeah.
And absolutely, you can look at many of the people that are in that profession, and they could directly attribute their interest in and life change because of the events that Billy Graham held, and his legacy of enduring value to a much greater degree than many others who have walked on this earth is a result of his faith. And we end where we began, and that's sprinting to the finish.
Sprinting through the finish. Well, I think we sprinted through the finish here, Reed. Thank you very much for sharing with us. And listeners, thank you for hanging in there with us. After so many weeks, we're coming to the end of season 1. Hard to believe. We appreciate you. I want you to know, however, that we're not done. We're going to dive into leadership in season 2, which will be coming soon. We're going to release some more details here shortly after this podcast is released. Until then, I'm Art Calderon. Be purposeful.
If you want to transform through purpose, that starts with where we began, understanding your faith, investing in your family, recognizing that part of that is production, and then ultimately enjoying rest and relaxation through that process. You establish and build your habits, and then you ultimately determine your purpose. Then you build this framework for that journey, but then don't quit. If you're at the end, sprint through the finish. Many of you who have been through a whole cycle of your life are now at the end of your life. And I realize that that can be exhausting and tiring. And I certainly am not there myself, but I've seen many that have been there. But you will always know, and I remember this specifically, that if you finish strong, it's a moment you can be proud of. And just as in the story with my grandfather, that ultimately will provide you the peace at the end of your life that you have given it all, even in the last and dying days. And so if you're at that stage of life or working towards it, define the purpose and how you want to live your life and the legacy of that purpose, then sprint towards the finish, and you can rest in peace. If you enjoyed this podcast and you're looking for more information, I've written a book that each and every one of these episodes are literally a chapter in the book, and you can dive in deeper, read it firsthand, and that book is going to be released in just a couple of months. Transform through purpose, your path to living an authentic and intentional life. The principles and stories in there will be very similar to what you heard on this podcast. And I hope that it helps you transform your life. You have one life to live. Decide what it is, and then decide to transform to live towards your purpose, and you and your world and your family and your life will be better for it. Thank you for being with us through this process. I look forward to hearing stories about how your life was authentically transformed and the impact it's having on your families and faith. And stay tuned for ReedFlections Season 2, where we're going to dive deep into leadership and ultimately through that process, how you can develop as a leader and develop others in their leadership journey as well. We look forward to hosting you in a couple of weeks as that journey begins.